to put it lightly, like that was about as shitty of a day as it gets, right? I was upset. Um, it was difficult to hear that because I didn't know what was going to happen next. So it only adds to the, sense of uncertainty, the lack of control you have because there's nothing you can really do about it other than keep calling and talking to doctors and nurses. And then we started to lose contact. So the next couple of days I don't hear from my mom, and it's harder and harder to get in touch with nurses. And so I'm like, what is happening? Like, really don't have any clue. Kind of in the dark.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, I am seated in the Hightstown Fire Department with Coach Austin Frank. Coach Austin Frank was my wrestling coach for 3 years in high school, and he is a man I really look up to because he lives up to what he preaches. He's not only built the Peddie Wrestling program up over the last, I think, 7-8 years at Peddie, maybe more, but he also is really involved in, it seems that service is a big theme in his life. He does volunteer firefighter work at Hightstown. He also is a teacher at the Peddie School, where he's educating the next generation of young adults. The Peddie Wrestling, just a little bit of history about Peddie Wrestling. In the 2000s, it was the Peddie Wrestling peak. Peddie Wrestling was at its peak. They were one of the best teams in Mercer County, I believe. And I think with coaching staff changes, it started to fall off. And over time, Peddie Wrestling started to lose some of the glory it saw. And then I believe when Coach
I mean, it was one of the best teams in the country, honestly. Yeah. I mean, they were competing with Blair. They were competing at a high level. So
I didn't know that much. That's insane. But I think you came in around 2016 at Peddie, right?
Yeah. So I graduated from Wesleyan in 2015, and I came that summer. So I got hired late. I don't know if I've told that story before, but it's definitely a story I can tell in terms of my path to Peddie and how I arrived at Peddie. But yeah, 2015. So this will be getting into year 10. So.
Well, yeah, it's amazing to hear that. I didn't know that Peddie. I know that they were really good in the 2000s, but I didn't know they were that caliber, like one of the best in the country.
Yeah, I mean, best in the country. There was Keith Holcomb in the 90s was, as far as back as my historical knowledge of the program goes, Keith Holcomb was the coach in the 90s. And then John Leonardis took over, and John in the 2000s really continued a lot of the success that Holcomb had with strong competitive wrestlers who were winning counties, who were competing against Blair kids, beating Blair, placing in the top 10 at prep nationals. The 2000s are the years of Danny White. Danny White was a 3-time prep national champion, really decorated wrestler for Peddie, who also was making, he was working his path into the Olympics and had gone out to Colorado to train and prepare for the Olympics and was going to make a run at that. So, Danny White is sort of the poster child of the success in the 2000s, but there are a number of really good wrestlers that came out during that time period of the 90s and the 2000s. So,
I'm not sure how much you know about Peddie as a whole back then, but what do you think was Peddie's perspective and I guess their goals and mission at the time? Because I know that also evolves with time, and I guess was athletics more of a priority for them? Like, is this just a wrestling story, or were other teams also performing well back then? And I guess what's the reason they were able to do so well? Like, were they really focusing on recruiting as many high quality guys as they could? And what happened maybe late 2000s when they started to lose some of the success?
Yeah, I mean, the question you ask is definitely multifaceted. There's more than one answer to this question about sort of the larger trajectory of athletics at Peddie over time. And I don't know that there is one specific answer. I think on the micro level, like when you really zoom in on it, it's all about consistency and in terms of coaching staff and not having a revolving door of coaches. When you have that, that really starts to break down in terms of the program and what you're able to maintain. So that I think is more important than anything else. And the same could be said for the leadership in terms of our athletic director, right? Like having consistency in leadership in that type of position, that also directly correlates and contributes to the success of any of the athletic programs, because it's the athletic director who ultimately possesses the vision of what athletics should look like. And after Leonardis left in the 2000s, there was, a relatively revolving door of coaches. I couldn't name all the coaches that there were, but there were quite a few between me and Leonardis. And so I think that certainly was a contributing factor to how the program sort of dwindled and was neglected to the point where it was when I sort of found it. School-wise, I don't know. Like, I think the more administrators and the more people who are sitting in positions to make decisions value the experience of athletics and its ability to provide an important education, then the greater the likelihood that that vehicle will be used in that regard, because people will support it even if it's not directly within their domain. And I'm not suggesting that we don't have that right now, but I think every leader has certain things that they focus on, maybe more than others. And I think in the early 2000s, around that time, there was a push by the school from various leadership standpoints to really increase the academic rigor. And there's been a ton of success in that regard. But with that, sometimes other things may have not intentionally fallen by the wayside, but unintentionally, like you're starting to put your attention towards one thing and other areas can become slightly neglected, whether consciously or subconsciously. So that's probably a contributing factor. There's a lot more that definitely goes into it. Like anything, when something really good starts to happen and trend, or something starts to trend in a poor direction, there's usually a multi-system component, right? Like there's more than one thing that's contributing to it. So
Yeah, so the leadership plays a big role in setting the vision, but also the priority, that what the main focus is, what the vision is. You mentioned this concept of the revolving door multiple times. Could you go back and define that real quick? Is it more just having enough coaches that there's maybe there's like a less of lack of coaches, so there's enough coaches to keep players going? But if that's the main point, I know that you've been talking about getting a lot of coaching staff for a wrestling program for a while, and I think this year we're starting to get like more and more coaches. I think it'll be the first time in a while, I think, that we had like 3 high quality coaches that have that wrestling experience. Or you can correct me if I'm wrong on that.
yeah, like I mean, every part of a program needs attention, and the analogy I use sometimes with wrestlers when I talk about like leveling up is like a video game analogy. You think about the different criteria, strength, you think about wrestling technique, you think about conditioning. Those are all the different areas that you level up, and as you level up, your overall score levels up. And you zoom out and you look at the program, there are different categories, right? The talent that we're able to recruit, the instruction that we're able to provide, the access to various resources, whether it's strength and conditioning or club, and then the coaching staff. And all of those, none of them can be minimized in terms of the role that they play in leveling up our program overall. And as a head coach, it's my job and my responsibility to be thinking about those different aspects of the program and how we can move them forward. And the trick is moving them forward at the same time in unison and not letting us take too many steps backwards, right? Every now and then, inevitably, you might have a step backwards or two, but the goal is to have more steps forward than steps backwards. And I think about it like the stock market, right? The stock market, you never run, right? You don't just like pull your money out when things get bad. You stay committed because long term the trajectory is going to be positive. And that's how I view the wrestling program, right? There's going to be up years, there's going to be down years, but is our overall trajectory in my time, is it continuing on a upward path? And I think it has been, and that's putting all these pieces in place. And coaching is a big part of that, right? Like the numbers that we have if you use basketball, for example, you have a varsity basketball program, you have a JV basketball program, you're going to have at least 4 coaches, 2 varsity coaches, 2 JV coaches. Those 2 programs might not even overlap with each other. They're almost like separate programs. We have built that in wrestling. In essence, we have 2 programs, and so now we need the coaching that reflects that, which is, people who are committed to our values and our process, but people who also have the pedigree to come in and offer additional levels of instruction, higher levels of instruction, and build out other aspects of the program. One of the coaches we're bringing on this year, Jason Lapham from he's a New Jersey State Trooper, wrestled at Penn State, and then finished his career at Ryder. He wants to build out a club component for Peddie Wrestling, and that is another piece that we need, right? This season in the fall, we're going to be going off campus to access club wrestling to compete against good wrestling, quality wrestling talent. That's how you get better. Iron sharpens iron. People say that all the time. You got to wrestle against good wrestlers to get better. But 4 or 5 years from now, it'd be ideal if we can stay in our room and we have that talent in the room. We don't have to go anywhere. It's homegrown. It's in our room. It's local, and it makes it more accessible. Like those are all the pieces, both short term and long term. So the revolving door piece. This is true with anything, not just wrestling and wrestling coaches. Anything, no matter what you do, I could convince anybody of this, requires consistency. Like anybody can come out and do anything for a day. Like that's not hard. But to do it weeks, years on end, that is hard. And that is where any real success happens and is earned. I think that's obvious, and that's obvious to someone like you for sure. But it's one of those things that truly is easier said than done, because it requires you to show up every single day and say, hey, like we're going to keep chipping away at this. It requires you to be willing to work through those moments of adversity when things aren't going well and say, well, I know it's going to get better because I'm putting the time in. And that's a truism in a lot of things. Sports, certainly life, various components of life, your career, showing up, putting the time in is always more than half the battle, because you've got to be there to get better. And so the revolving door of coaches in any leadership role, when you lack that consistency, people just move on, then you're not building anything. You can't build a foundation because you're constantly handing it off and then kind of starting from scratch and resetting. The goal here is through consistency, 10, 15, 20 years, we build something here, 15 years you come back, Coach Frank's an old man, but we've got something we put together that all these groups year after year have been a part of. And then when I go to pass it on to someone else, it's someone who's been sort of in the gate, learning and mentoring with under my tutelage and with our coaching staff, and then is ready to take it over and put 20 more years in or 10 more years in, and then pass it on to somebody else the same way. That's really how you build something of value, right? Through that type of consistency. So
I think that when you start thinking long-term instead of short-term, I feel like your whole strategy kind of changes. And that can go for you in the wrestling program, but honestly, anything in life too. Because when I look at even successful businesses and a lot of companies that have grown over time and have become powerful, like Amazon, for example, their main focus was over time thinking about the long-term strategy instead of the short-term strategy, right? Because I think if you think about the short-term strategy, you start focusing on the fastest way to get growth and the fastest way to get some arbitrary number that makes you seem qualified in a way. But I think when you focus on the long-term journey, as you were describing, then you really build a more strong foundation to build something that lasts. So you were telling me that before, that you kind of had some philosophy shifts when you're thinking about the season ahead. And in what way do you think that thinking long-term has helped you to maybe think about the program differently as you look forward?
Yeah, the long-term piece, I think like that is the delicate balance of being a leader in a position where you're trying to build something out and you're trying to create. I would argue that what I'm trying to do is a lot easier than trying to maintain something, right? Like if you think about if we're just sticking with wrestling as an example, but you could use any sport, you could use any organization, right? Like what Bill Gates did with Microsoft, incredible. He built that, and people look at that and they say, "Wow, look what that guy did!" Right? He was able to do that through his own creative lens and his own creative vision. But then it's like, who's up after that guy, right? Like Steve Jobs builds Apple. Like, who's going to maintain that? They're setting a high standard. I think that's harder. I think it's harder to maintain something over the long term. So look at Blair, right? I have tons of respect for Blair Academy and Blair's wrestling program, what they've been able to accomplish, because they've been able to maintain this program over a duration of a long period of time. Like, heavy is the head that wears the crown, and then heavy is the head that wears the crown for decades. And so that's a long way of saying, like, to build this thing out has just been fun, right? Because there's no expectations. It's whatever my vision is, and in that vision. So, but to do that, and to answer your question, you have to think about both at the same time, and you have to multitask it. And it's really hard, because sometimes you're putting more into one category than the other: the short term, the mid range, and the long term. But really, it often feels like the season ahead, the year ahead, and then 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road. What does 5 years down the road look like? Having a club on campus that has sessions 3 times a week and has a youth component, has a varsity wrestler competitive component. Like, okay, that's a long-term thing we can work towards. And every so often you're putting a little bit in the bank to build towards that goal. And then the short term is like season to season. What do we have? What's in front of us? What wrestlers are we coming in with? What's our coaching staff look like? Where are we at as a whole? And how are we going to maximize each year what we're trying to accomplish and what we can get out of that group, both in terms of the lessons that we can learn and the success that we can have on the mat. And I think obviously those two things are correlated and overlap. So when I think about this upcoming season in particular, and I think about what is going to put us on the best path of success, I mean, unquestionably it's being unwilling to make any sacrifices in terms of who we are, our identity, our culture. Like, that is, we are going to be unwavering as always in our identity in terms of, wrestling training for the rest of your life, and always in the fight, and really driving those principles home and through in everybody in the program and on the team. So, but what I really think when I think about it year to year, it's more so an evolution than it is a change. We're not going to change or pivot from what we've been doing, but rather instead we're going to evolve. We're going to evolve a lot of those concepts and build them out. And so it'd be cool to, in fact, record it and write it down year to year, sort of what those evolutions are. But the evolution this year specifically that I've been thinking a lot about is a simple one that we're going to really hang our hats on, which is, we've talked about always in the fight. We've talked about wrestling training for the rest of your life. We've talked about focusing. Last year, we were emphasizing focusing progress, right? Like, it's not about the wins and losses. It's about whether or not you're improving, right? It's about your effort. How do you feel when you walk off the mat? And this year, I want the theme to be that we're going to hammer hard is nobody's coming. Like, nobody's coming, right? And that's not something I've created. It's something I'm borrowing. And it's ripe in literature. It's ripe in music. You can find it anywhere. Quemar los barcos, right? Burn the boats, because we're staying here and we're going to fight our way through, and we're not going to look back. We're not going to retreat, that idea of no retreat. But for me, like, nobody is coming. Nobody else is coming. More than anything, what it really reinforces is it reinforces this idea of self-reliance. That's really what it's about, right? Nobody's coming. Sounds really like definitive and, intense, and it is, but it's really a message about self-reliance, right? So it's this idea that you have to learn how to be able to operate and get a job done and accomplish your task on your own without anyone's help. That doesn't mean you're not going to have other people's help. It doesn't mean that you should be like a lone wolf mentality and I don't need anyone's help. That's not helpful either. And I can elaborate on that in a minute, but it's this idea that like, in order to be able to do anything else, you need to first know that like, hey, I'm going to be able to rely on me. And like, to get this task done, I know that I can rely on myself to be able to do what I need to get done, because that's going to then get you to be able to access whatever else is going to come later on, whether it be help from other people. And I think wrestling is really perfectly situated to teach that lesson and to carry that value, because it's an individual sport in many respects, in particular the competition piece. When you're out on the mat one-on-one, truly no one else in that moment is really coming, right? There are many team aspects to wrestling, but you're out on the mat on your own. And so I think there are some really relatable life lessons that can come from that are really important for our wrestlers. But it's really what I want to sort of have as a pillar, if you will, of our season this year. And I'm excited to explore like how that will manifest. So where, like, again, you can find it, like, you can find the concept of nobody is coming anywhere in multiple places. You know, the military, certainly like things like law enforcement, etc. For me, where nobody is coming or nobody else is coming, what sparked that idea for me, sometimes I pick up the stuff that we implement in the wrestling room from different influences, right? Like, I think I may have told you this story. The very first like foundational piece of Peddie Wrestling, and this is exclusive content if I didn't tell this before, but the Baruah podcast gets exclusive content. That's just the way it is. You have to listen to the podcast to get like the cool stuff. This is an Easter egg. Not a lot of people know this. I'm very limited in this story and sharing the story. Peddie, training for the rest of your life. I was in the wrestling room, 23 years old, just got asked to take over the program. There had been high-level discussions about cutting wrestling at Peddie altogether. And, for whatever reason, they asked me, 23 years old, 24 years old, hey, do you want to take this on and see what you can do with it? And so a month or two after that, right, like first step, thinking 10 years out, 15 years out, where are we going to be? Well, first step is, let's get this room sorted out. Let's start sorting this room out, because where we practice, where we exist matters a lot. And so I'm going through all the stuff in the wrestling room. I'm cleaning up. I painted the floors, right? Like, I'm in there getting it done, controlling what I can control in that early moment, because there's a lot I can't control at that time, right? I'm inheriting wrestlers that I didn't personally recruit who were totally great kids, and I was excited to work with them. But there's a lot that comes with changing the culture of program. It doesn't happen in 1 year. But I'm like, all right, like we need a guiding principle that we can start with and we can build from. And I'm going through all this stuff in the wrestling room. I find all this cool stuff, right? You talk about, you opened with the history of the program, the 2000s, the 90s. There was this old certificate in there from USA Wrestling it was a certificate to certify the club that existed at Peddie at that time. It was called the Talon. And it was like, the Talon 2002, like, USA Wrestling Certified Club. And there were a bunch of VHS tapes in there with these like old school wrestlers, Brands Brothers, John Smith, etc. And there's these VHS tapes, because this was before YouTube, when you have instructional videos. And I look at one of the VHS tapes and it said training for the rest of your life on it. Like, legit. Like, I didn't, I never take credit for these being like original concepts all the time, but how we build them into the program and how we build it out and make it relatable to Peddie, that is what becomes ours. And so it might not have been exactly the same wording. It might not have been like wrestling training for the rest of your life, but it was some version of that. And again, there's no way you can be original in that, because education through athletics, education through wrestling in terms of life lessons, like, that is a known quantity. Like, people talk about that all the time. But I was just like, that is simple, it's direct, it's straightforward, and it's true. And it's like, let's focus on that to start this thing out. And that's something that we can really scaffold from and build out from. So I love that story, just because I legitimately stumbled on it very organically in our wrestling room with this VHS tape. And I just think it's like really humble origins for the program. And I always reflect fondly on that. But There's this firehouse down in Delaware that I've done some work with recently, and have been exposing myself to because they have a reputation of having a really strong culture, and they're called Christiana Fire Department down in Delaware, and they're unique because they're a combination fire department. You have career firefighters and volunteer firefighters working together at the same time, intermixed on trucks, going to fight fires, and they fight a lot of fire down there, more than a lot of areas. And in their weight room in that firehouse, there's a flag, and on that flag it says nobody else is coming, and then at the bottom in like finer print it says it's up to you. And so that's this idea. And I was like thinking about that and reflecting, and I was like, well, in the fire service, the implications of that are clear. If you're a truck guy and you're going to do a search and there's victims trapped on the report of the fire, and you're going to a dwelling with victims trapped, and you have your job, you're the barman, you're the can man, whatever your job is, like, it's you. There's no other barman who's coming behind you to go get that person. Like, and that thought is simultaneously unnerving but also empowering, because it's like, you've got to get the job done. That person who might be in trouble is counting on you to get it done, and you have to be able to operate in that moment to accomplish that task. It just so happens that in that moment, that is a life or death situation, right? Whether or not you find that person in your search and you're able to pull them to safety, right? That's firefighting specific, and the stakes are high. So like, no one else is coming means a lot in that moment. But I thought about that and I was like, well, that nobody else is coming, that's not just firefighting, that's everything. Like, you got to make that deal in your career. Well, it's up to you to seal that deal. Nobody else is coming. And really simple things, like think about everyday life tasks, like making doctor's appointments. It sounds really mundane and silly, but like, you've got to be self-reliant. You've got to be able to figure that stuff out, because you can't just rely on other people all the time to do all of the menial tasks for you. Like, you've got to be able to know that you can sort of operate in isolation when needed. And again, I go back to this idea, not lone wolf, not advocating for that. I think that's garbage. I don't want young guys out there thinking like, oh, I can do everything on myself. Like Coach Frank is saying, self-reliance, independence, like be a lone wolf. No, that's not what I'm saying at all. That's bad. I don't agree with that. So much of firefighting is working together as a team. But, and I think I've said that in the past as well, maybe in the last podcast, right? 343, so many firefighters died in 9/11, 343, because they do everything together as a group for the most part, right? Sometimes you're sent on your own to do a task. That's where that self-reliance comes in. But there's going to be periods in your life where no one else is coming. You've got to figure it out. You've got to do it on your own until reinforcements come. They're going to come. Your family's going to come. People who love you, they're going to come. But it's like, what do you do? And partly what defines you in moments in life is, what do you do when nobody is coming? How do you respond? How do you figure that out? It's hard. It's super uncomfortable. But when you do that, then when people do come and when the help is coming, then it's like, all right, like, we're good. Because I just was able to like kind of hold back the onslaught for, however long I needed to. And now the gang's here and like, we're ready to roll and we're good. So, I think that's super true in wrestling, but true in life, of course. And so, yeah, that's the nobody else is coming is going to be a pillar for us, and certainly an evolution, and then something that we'll continue to, bring into the fold for years to come, hopefully. We'll see.
It's kind of ironic because someone, as you said, who might listen to that quote, nobody's coming, will just immediately jump to the ideology that this is probably just a lone wolf mindset. But I think it's those guiding principles that bleed into the team that brings the team together. Like, it becomes a culture that kind of unites everyone. So while it might seem at the surface level that this is just advocating for something that's be more individualistic, be more self-reliant, I think that's what brings everyone together. And one of the things I find fascinating about your coaching style and the way you do it is that I guess you always start with the central mindset or the central theme, whether that be for the team as a whole or for the season upcoming. And in a way, it might seem like a small thing to do. Like, I'm just writing down a quote on the wall, but I think when people join the wrestling program, they're not really just coming here to choose to wrestle. They're kind of buying into the whole ideology of what it means to be a wrestler. Like I think when people come into the program, they might feel so different from the people around them, but I think all of a sudden they can all feel that connection with them. That they all might be different in their ways of where they came from and what they do in their life, but they can all hear the quote "always in the fight" and all feel the same kind of energy. And I've not really talked to many people that have approached it in that way, but I find it really fascinating. So have you ever just like spent time reflecting on like this is my coaching style, or anything that's kind of just came to be in your nature of doing things, and has it always been that way as well?
Yeah, I like to categorize coaching into I think a lot about a lot of things, obviously, but when I think about coaching in particular, like you can be a good wrestler and you could have a strong wrestling pedigree but not be a good coach, right? Because to be a coach is, again, there are so many factors that go into it. You have to have the wrestling pedigree. You have to have the technique. That's a given, right? That's what a lot of people are looking for. They want to be able to improve. Um, but you need to also have a leadership style and capabilities that can motivate your athletes. You need to be able to troubleshoot and figure out like, how am I going to get this group to work together? How am I going to get them to make each other stronger? How am I going to get them to, see what we're trying to accomplish overall and work towards that goal? And how do I manage the coaching staff to work towards that goal? How do I manage conversations with administrators to be able to find ways to rally around that cause and support that cause? And so I just think I think it's all about identifying each of those areas, just like we will for our athletes, and then figuring out ways to improve each of those areas. So it's like, all right, you start with a baseline level of skill in terms of wrestling technique, but how are you improving that every single year? And I think about that as a wrestling coach year to year, right? Like, what am I doing to develop myself as a coach to make us better in terms of our technique? But then another big category is like, what am I doing to contribute to the overall culture of the program, to continue to evolve the culture of the program? So I think about those two things, I think the most, which is the technique piece. Like, how am I serving our athletes from a technique standpoint and putting them in a position for success, whether it's myself or other coaches? And I have some thoughts on that for this year as well. But for the culture side of things, it's the nobody else is coming or nobody is coming concept, right? And I think, like, you talk about like coaching strategy, right? Like, I try to be an all comprehensive coach as much as I can, recognizing strengths and weaknesses in different areas and then focusing on those areas and, like I said, improving them. But I think for me, the culture aspect and, like you said, the values, the pillars of the program, like that, like, you can say what you want. I know it from experience. Like, anybody can say what they want. The wrestling isn't exactly what everyone looks back and remembers 20 years from now, 30 years from now. You look back at like what you did together and what you believed in and the identity of who you collectively were as an individual and what it meant to you as a team. And like, that's how you build a program, right? Like, we could be a wrestling team and just be good at wrestling. But I don't want that. I want a wrestling program. It's much more comprehensive. It's much more involved. In order to do that, you have to have good culture, and you have to have something that is guiding that culture, and that's these ideas. And so I think that is the harder part of coaching. And I think I'm fortunate that that's something that I enjoy more than anything, right? The technique piece, I'm not going to say that wrestling coaches are a dime a dozen and you could find anyone to teach technique. It's certainly nuanced, and I don't want to diminish that. But as long as you're willing to work hard, like, you can learn technique, right? Like, any coach can become a more than adequate and efficient coach simply by putting the time in. There's so much resource. There's so many resources out there. It's not a secret how to wrestle. It's hand fighting. It's head position. It's head hands defense, right? Like, it's heel toe knee, right? It's your penetration shots. It's keeping good position, holding good position. Like, wrestling technique, percentage wise, it's not complicated. And so you can really teach anyone to do that. And there's so many examples of that out there, of coaches who have learned the sport later in life and didn't wrestle and led really successful programs. So I'm not diminishing it. I'm not saying I don't worry about it. And it is an area that I continue to evolve in. Every year I get better as a coach technique wise. But like the culture piece is a very more nuanced and intentional aspect of being a good coach that isn't as easy to teach because it's more of an art, right? Technique is more of a science in some respects, whereas the building of culture is certainly much more of an art. It's more of a poetry. It's more of a writing a narrative and creating a narrative, building a story that people can rally around. And that part excites me more than anything. And as we build out our coaching staff, I can do more and more of that because I can say, all right, Coach Lapham, like, this guy's a stud. Like, he's going to teach outside singles and finishing outside singles from, sub series or waterfall and, cutting the corner and, and I can then continue to step back and look at the bigger picture from that sort of, zoomed out head coach sort of perspective. So, but yeah, so that's kind of how I'd answer that question. And I just think there's so much power in the pillars and the values that we develop and what we rally around. It's the things that we remember. And then what's cool about that, I think, is how everyone personalizes it and applies it to themselves, right? Like, because always in the fight is a concept that we all rally around, but what that means to every individual is unique. And I like that because you apply it to your own experiences. So for example, more content for the Baruah podcast that is privileged content. This is about as privileged as it gets, and it's a story. So always in the fight and nobody else is coming. Here's an example of a real life application where they overlap and intertwine. And it just so happens to be one of the most important people in my life, which is my mom, which, for a number of reasons. Well, she birthed me, she raised me, right? Great. Thanks, Mom. But more than that, my mom has been an inspiration, hopefully, like many parents or guardians or adults, mentors people have in their life. And so this is a COVID story. My mom, COVID started to hit in February, March of 2020, right? I think. And she got sick right when COVID hit. So end of March, early April, she got incredibly sick. She was, staying at her house. So I wasn't able to see her. I wasn't with her. But she got so sick and she was like, she's tough, right? I get my toughness from my parents, my mom, my dad. And they're tough. Like, they want to weather things out. They're not people that are quick to, seek help right away because they're like, all right, let me kind of see where this goes. So my mom's getting sicker. Everything's coming out with COVID, all these unknowns that we're grappling with. And I'm like, Ma, you gotta go get it checked out. It's getting to a point, we don't want to delay this. And, people I trust who have medical background were like, yeah, you should definitely encourage your mom to go seek help. So she ends up going to the doctors, gets really sick, has to then get transported to a hospital. And she goes to the hospital and of course she has COVID. It's the Wild West. Nobody knows what the hell's going on. Doctors don't know what the hell's going on. They're doing the best they can. Nurses doing the best they can, but nobody knows. Nobody has answers. How could they? No one could expect this global pandemic to hit the way it did. So it's a mess, right? To put it lightly, it's a shit show and it's scary, right? I was legitimately, anyone who ever says they aren't scared or don't get scared, they're full of it. I was scared for my mom. This was legitimately life or death. I was like, she could die. The stakes are incredibly high. So you can't visit her. You can't go see her. Can't spend time in the hospital. They won't allow it. So there's limitations there. So she's on her own, right? Nobody's coming. No one can come. It's not allowed. And she's in the hospital for a week, 2 weeks. I'm calling every day. I call in the morning. I call at night when the nurses change shifts. I call during the day. I'm talking to doctors. It's just my family dynamic. I ended up having to be the point person. And to be quite honest, I'm glad I was, right? I like to do stuff like that. I like working logistics and, being a point person, which I was a point person for my mom's care during COVID. And so, scary moments throughout, without getting too far into the weeds, we hit a point right around, I think it was Easter that year. So it might have been like 2 weeks in. It was a Sunday where the doctors are like, she's not getting better. We're trying different things. She's getting worse. Her SpO2, which is her oxygen intake, is diminishing. And they're like, we're going to maybe have to intubate her and put her on heavier forms of oxygen, where she might even be on a ventilator. And at that time, that ventilator in a lot of cases felt like a death sentence. Like that's the next step before somebody expires from COVID. So to put it lightly, like that was about as shitty of a day as it gets, right? I was upset. It was difficult to hear that because I didn't know what was going to happen next. So it only adds to the sense of uncertainty, the lack of control you have, because there's nothing you can really do about it other than keep calling and talking to doctors and nurses. And then we started to lose contact. So the next couple of days, I don't hear from my mom, and it's harder and harder to get in touch with nurses. And so I'm like, what is happening? Like, really don't have any clue. Kind of in the dark. Yeah.
So you mentioned that you were starting to lose contact. Was that because she wasn't able to speak, or why was it difficult to reach the nurses at the time?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and again, sure, like this is exclusive content. I really haven't shared the story with many people, but so something happens when you're that sick and you're spending that much time in the hospital, and your brain isn't receiving enough oxygen. And in this case, in her case, it was a form of what they call like hospital psychosis, where she was starting to lose her ability to understand where she was, what was going on around her. And it was very scary. And I actually have some clips, like video chatting with her in the hospital, where I could tell she was starting to get more and more confused, right? Because of that cyanotic lack of oxygenation, the brain just isn't firing on all cylinders. And COVID was affecting her ability to exchange oxygen into her bloodstream, which is what was causing that outcome. So it got to a point where it was so bad that like she didn't know where she was. To put it bluntly, like she didn't know where she was. She didn't know what was happening. She was just like off in a whole different world. So she didn't think to call us, and the nurses were so busy that it felt bad to even ask them to try to like set up a FaceTime. And if we did, she wouldn't really know who I was or what was going on. So it was like 2 days after they told us this ventilator situation might happen, and all of a sudden her SpO2 numbers, which is what I was focusing on more than anything else, started to climb, right? She was starting to make a comeback. And they had some like really random like trial drugs that they had been giving a shot on some people with, that we were able to get her in a situation where she was able to use them. And I don't know if it was that or what it was, but she started to recover. She started to turn a corner. We're like 3 weeks in of her being in the hospital. And her case was so legit and her recovery was so profound that there's a video, and it was like on the news, like some local news outlets, where all the nurses and doctors clapped for her when she finally was able to leave the hospital, because it was that profound of a recovery. And so it was like, I've thought about that a lot, and it was profoundly impactful for me and on my life, because it was just like, wow, what a strong woman, for her to be able to persevere through that difficult challenge set forth through her health. But it's like, well, what allowed her to do that, right? And there's the lesson. It's like always in the fight, no question. Like at no point was Mama Frank like, yeah, I'm out, like I'm done, put a fork in me. No, that's not Mama Frank. Mama Frank is like, hey, I'm in this fight. I'm always in this fight. And she said on the phone to me and to the doctors regularly, she said, I don't want to die, and I don't plan to die. She had no plan for that, right? And the things you plan for are what happens. She didn't plan to die. She was planning to live. And so she comes out of the hospital. Towards the end, when she started to get better, I was able to video face chat with her as she started to get better. And the sense of relief, you can't imagine, right? The weight off of our shoulders as she started to turn the corner. It was like, all right, things are going to get better. And they're probably not going to get worse because she's turned the corner. And they didn't. And so like I asked her what helped her through that. And right, like it's that always in the fight mentality, but it's nobody else is coming, because Nobody could be there. No one could really do anything for her. It didn't matter how much I called the doctors. It didn't matter how much I called the nurses. It didn't matter what I did. I wanted to control things, but I couldn't. It was up to her. Her body was in a battle for her life, and she was going to have to win that battle on her own. I couldn't fight that fight for her. She had to fight that fight. She had to find the motivation, the will to live, and she did because she cared about the people in her life, and the sense of love she has was so profound. And she said to me after she came out of the hospital that it was the pictures of her children that she carries in her wallet, that she had next to her bedside, that was a constant force of like, I need to be here for my kids, and I love my kids so deeply that like nothing's going to stand in between me and them. And so that's like, for me, that's a great story and a great example of where you see the overlap in always in the fight and nobody else is coming, because it's like, literally in the fight of her life, she found a way to persevere, and she did it on her own. And, yes, there was a team of doctors. Yes, there were family members advocating for her. But at the end of the day, if you want it, you've got to get it. You've got to fight for it. Because if you don't want it, no one else is going to be able to help you.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. It's an incredible story that I know will stick with me, because it does, I think, perfectly exemplify both of those vision statements. What would you call it? Values. Values. Pillars. It really exemplifies both of them. And we've talked about the nobody's coming, but I think hearing your story, I think another way to reframe, like always in the fight, I think another element of it is conviction. And I think what you must have seen in your mother that day was that she had a deep belief that she said herself that she has no plans to die. It's not that even beyond I don't want to die, it's that I don't have plans to die. I think that word really stuck with me, because I think it really goes back to the beliefs you have in the mind and how they kind of manifest into reality. And in a way, that value of always in the fight translated into wrestling as the beliefs you have about yourself kind of get translated into wrestling matches as well, right? If you go in a match with a poor self-image that you kind of just think that I might lose this match, I might get pinned, or you have those like negative thought patterns, you don't have the conviction or belief in yourself, it does in a way reflect the performance you have. At least I've seen that in myself as well. But I'm curious if you could go more into how you felt that day, when the relief you must have felt after you were able to speak with her on the phone again. Like, what did that feel like for you?
Yeah, I think going back to your point, like the mentality piece is another factor, X factor of wrestling for coaches, and how you get to maximize an athlete's potential from a mindset standpoint, but then for the individual as well. And that was true for me when I was a wrestler, right? Like, and I tell stories in the room about this sometimes, but like when I went out and wrestled an opponent, like for me, I made the stakes high because I knew that I needed to have that plan in my mind, like what I was fighting for. Like it was more than me just going out to win. It was me going out to win for what, or for who, and for why. And when you can answer those questions, it levels up your abilities in a whole nother ballgame, because your motivations are going to be more than that other person. It gives you that edge that other person won't have. And in the sport of wrestling, you need to find every edge and exploit every edge that you possibly can. But the emotions, man, like, I'm not someone who I'm not someone who publicly emotes. I'm not someone who necessarily wears my emotions on my sleeve. And that's not because, of course, I don't feel them, but, I just process them and, share them in different ways. And everyone has their own way of sort of, how they share those emotions. But, yeah, the range, right? It's really about the range, right? They say to understand happiness and joy, you have to understand tragedy and pain and suffering. I think that is without question true. It's rooted in, all sort of ancient religions and sort of Buddhist concepts and stuff like that. And the sort of the yin and the yang, right? We talk about yin and the yang in wrestling. And for every move, you need to have a decision that you can make to counter that or to work with that sort of in this sort of fluid state. And that was true of that moment with my mom. It was the range of heightened emotions. It was like one of the worst days of my life. Like my mom's going to die and I'm scared as hell and I don't want her to. But I don't think I can do anything about it. So feeling helpless, feeling sad, feeling like just really without purpose and without anything to do, right? Like during that time, we were still teaching classes. So I was managing a lot of the stuff with my mom and teaching class. And that was the best reprieve I had from all of those really strong emotions. Being in the classroom with Peddie students was like the best distraction in the world, because it was time I wasn't reading articles and pouring into the science and trying to educate myself on what was happening to her body and what doctors were trying to think about. But the emotions were stress, feeling desperation, sadness that day. Like, it was about as bad as news as you can get. I remember walking with Miss Hewlett behind the chapel over on Etcher Road back there, and I definitely got pretty worked up. I was emotional that day, and I was worried about someone I loved, and so that was like the thought process where my mind was going in that moment. You can only imagine. It's, like I said, one of the worst days of your life. So then like 2-3 days later, she's getting on FaceTime and she's having like full conversations and starting to like kind of understand what she's got going on and where she is and her actual values. The metrics that we can track to check her progress are improving. Like, I don't know how to explain that. You have to feel it. And I don't wish it on anybody because it sucks to have that range. It guts you. But I would never know what that felt like in that moment, that sense of relief, if I hadn't known where I was 2 days before. And that context, I think, is important. And I'm grateful that I was able to feel that, because it was just like, like laughing and smiling. Even though she wasn't great, I was like ear to ear on the phone with her, and I can like still picture myself just like probably my voice trembling a little bit, like feeling super uneasy, but feeling like, holy crap, like whoa, like we're coming up for legitimately for air, but like that feeling of coming up for air after being underwater for a long time. So intense, I would say, intense emotions for sure.
Sure, this is like
legit exclusive content. Like I've been very careful about like sharing the story because it is very personal, and I'm not someone who's big on like sharing super personal stuff, but you have to find balance in that too. It's like, some stories are only meant for you to hold on to, and there's certainly stories out there I think that I'll probably never share with other people or with only with very few people, but then there's another side to that, because it's like in not telling that story or not telling a story, you also then deprive other people of like hearing the lessons learned through it. And I think that's unfortunate if you don't do that. So it's like, all right, like as time has passed and I've had a lot of time to think about it, I definitely find value in sharing it. And, like I said, the Baruah podcast gets exclusive content. So.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I think I can understand that feeling of not wanting to share a story, but I think if I look back at some of the biggest changes in myself over time, I feel like some stories have been so impactful for me when I hear other people's stories, that I feel like even just hearing someone's story, like if someone could hear your story and their entire parts of their life could change from the lessons derived from that. So I do think there's a delicate balance you need to find. Obviously, you don't want to be on one side where just like, I can understand the feeling of not wanting to constantly share things about yourself and make yourself the center of attention. But at the same time, there is so much value that can be derived from hearing like some of the more emotional, deeper parts of people's lives. And I also think even for the individual telling the story, I found that when I've told other people's stories about myself, I feel like I understand the story back in a different way, which is an interesting way. Maybe it's my personal way of processing it, but I found that there's something interesting about speaking in a way, that even if it's just my mom or my friend, or not even broadcasting it, but even just telling someone, it's hard to describe in words what that feels like, but it's almost like kind of a relief that it's all of a sudden not this thing that's going in loops in your brain, and now it's like a thing that you can grapple with. And I don't know, it's an interesting feeling.
You want me to? Yeah.
We can transition. So one more last question that I was curious about with the story we were talking about. Would you seem like a person that's had a strong relationship with your mom for a while, for a long time, but would you describe any changes in your relationship after that event, or even maybe a sense of gratitude, or how would you describe your relationship with your mom change in the following the 4 years that have passed since then?
Yeah. Yeah. I think what you said about sharing stories is spot on, and I think it's something that is very individual, person to person, and I agree with you. And I think with time, I'm a slow sharer, so it just like takes time to process, and then some of that starts to come out more. But my relationship with my mom, man, I don't know. It's, I wouldn't consider myself a mama's boy, right? Like I think that can sometimes carry a sort of odd connotation. I love my parents both equally, and I would say that I have been inspired by and learned lessons through both of them in really profound ways. I'm incredibly fortunate to look at both of my parents and be like, wow, they're my legit heroes. And it's a cool evolution because it's like when I was a kid, my dad was my hero because of the work he did. Like he was out getting the bad guys. But it's like now my dad's a hero because the way he lives his life, right? Like my dad's a hero because he chooses to live a healthy lifestyle and he's made decisions and committed himself to that. He's been incredibly disciplined in it. And my dad's a hero because of the way that he like always showed up for me and my brother, even when he didn't have to. Like when I was 18, I wasn't thinking about that. But now I'm, 31 years old and I'm thinking about how I raise kids in a wrestling program. I'm like, damn, the way my dad did it is pretty unique, pretty profound, and exemplary and heroic. And so it's cool how your perception of things will change over time as you start to think about them differently. But my relationship with my mom, I wouldn't say that it changed dramatically one way or another after that event. I think it was really hard for anyone, including myself and her, to talk about immediately after, even now still, because it was, people throw around like the concept of trauma, right? Like for her especially, it was a very traumatic experience. And so it can be hard to kind of process all of that. And, I don't think she liked talking about it afterwards necessarily.
You good right now?
Yeah. So it was just like we didn't talk about it, and like I don't know, like I just love my mom, I love my dad more than anything in this world, and our relationship has definitely developed in ways I maybe wouldn't have expected in the time that we've been able to have together, but I wouldn't trade it for the world because my mom did a lot for me and my brother growing up as kids. She went above and beyond to provide for us, and that sometimes meant making sacrifices in ways that were going to be really difficult for her. And that continues to be the type of person she is today. She puts other people's needs first. She sacrifices, and that has without question influenced the leader that I've become because, it's leadership through sacrifice, and that's exactly who she was and has been and always has been as a mom. And so it comes as no surprise, tying it back to her experience with COVID, that it was the pictures of her children that were the motivation for her to really like push through and come out on top. I don't know what I believe in religion wise. That's a whole nother podcast, but like there was something happening there for her and with her. And so now it's like, our relationship, like, personally, like I wouldn't trade that for the world at this point. I wish she didn't get sick, but when I look back, like of all of the things she's done that I've been impressed by, which is a lot, like that one in particular, like that's a story I'll never forget because it's like, damn, that woman, like she's got that dog in her for sure, right? Like, life threw at her one of the biggest challenges she could face and she came out on top. And it's like, wow, I'm like, I love her. I'm proud of her. I'm amazed. I'm inspired. And that, I think that example is just really a sort of concentrated version of all those things in one. So.
Yeah, I like how you frame it as the heroes. Because I guess I never thought of it personally that way, but I guess it's amazing how it could be the concept of a hero can be so different person to person, as in like what they look for in their heroes and maybe their life experiences that come together to really define for them like who their hero is and what they really look for in that hero. But it's really interesting how as you also change with time, the things you value and the people you look up to also change with time. Because I mean, you personally develop, you personally gain some success or gain some experience that teaches you different lessons, and then maybe even look at some people that have been heroes your whole life but in a different way, and you see these other things in the background that you value in them as well over time. And I'm curious how that will look for me in the years to come as well. But yeah, I'd love to transition to the technique aspect of your vision for the upcoming season, but I do have to use the bathroom. I think this coconut water is going to make me want to. So this is our bathroom here. Take a quick pause. Right back.
Yeah, the bathroom is go right past this table here, make a left, and the bathroom's on the left. Yeah.
All right. So talk me through your vision for the season in regards to the mindset shifts you've had with your technique.
Yeah, so first I want to say this. I think I'm at a point now in my wrestling career. This has been my progression. I think logically it makes so much sense for us to adopt freestyle wrestling across all levels. I don't think it'll happen, right? We've been so rooted in our folk style system. But if you look at what happened this past Olympics, we have our wrestlers speaking one language, and then when they graduate college, after they've spoken that language their whole life, we're asking them to go and speak this completely new, different language. A lot of the same core features, like foundational elements, but two different languages, and then they have to go and speak that different language in their adult career, in their freestyle senior level pursuits. And I just don't think we're putting our athletes in the U.S. in the best position for success, because international athletes across the board, they're all wrestling freestyle from the time that they're little kids. We're the only country. It's like imperial versus the metric system. We're the only country who's using that system, and then we're being forced to use a different system after college. So I'm not making excuses for Team USA, but like look at the women, right? Like women in women's wrestling, the trend has been to start women and young girls on freestyle and have them stick with freestyle. College wrestling is going to be freestyle. There's a reason for that. Now the challenge is like I don't think people are going to be willing to change, because change is hard, and we've been doing folk style for forever. So I get that. I think emotionally there's a lot of attachment to folk style. But I think logically, when you really sit down and think about it, it makes sense for us to eventually transition to freestyle. Whether or not it'll actually happen, I don't know. But I don't envision the world adapting to folk style. That's not going to happen. So, and don't get me wrong, it's different. Like there are pros and cons to both styles, but I like freestyle. The more I've watched it, the more I've appreciated it. So, but technique going into this season, here's the big evolution. Here's the big shift. It's thinking about percentages and thinking about the tools that we have in our toolbox, right? Like you could have 100 tools in your toolbox, but if you only use 5, and you only need 5, you're kind of taking up space and you're carrying around a really heavy toolbox that you don't really need, and you're not going to find good use out of. It's inefficient. So it's like, all right, like ball and chain. I can teach you a ball and chain. I can take 40 minutes out of practice to show everybody how to execute a ball and chain. But how many people are really hanging their hat on a ball and chain? How many people are, making their way to the NCAA finals with a ball and chain? It's not common. I'm not saying it shouldn't be taught, but I'm just saying the amount of time and energy that we put into certain stuff requires a lot of precise evaluation. And then thinking about what is going to be most helpful percentage-wise in our matches. And so it's like, I think this year is really about refining the toolbox and focusing on what's going to carry us the most, and really specializing in certain aspects of technique instead of being a jack of all trades, which has been my approach to wrestling as a coach over the years. I want to do more of like, hey, let's work a front head, right? Number 1 takedown in wrestling, number 1 scoring position, super high percentage. Like, let's not just spend 3-4 days on a front head, drill it every now and then. Like, let's make that part of our everyday structure. Every day, part of our warm-up, we're going to hit a couple front heads each. And then we're going to branch off of that, because every wrestling position, it's not just one technique, one and done, right? There's the yin and the yang. There's the, there's the bull by. There's the Iowa score behind. There's the, there's the the chin and bar, your cement mixer, right? There's all these variations off of a front head, a near side cradle. And so I want to do more of focusing on the high percentage, really more efficient moves that we will use the most, and putting as much of our practice time into that as possible, because at the end of the day, you have practice time each day, and then you have like the larger aggregate. I don't know what it is. Let's say, we have 200 hours on the season. Like, how we use those 200 hours over the course of the season matters. And if we're only spending 3 hours on front heads, and we're putting all this other time into moves that we're not really going to use that much, it's not an efficient use of our time. So I want to dial that in. That's really what I want to sort of focus on.
Yeah, it's an interesting mindset shift, because I think it was something I realized more in my senior year is that you don't really have much time in the room. Like, I think going to sophomore year, junior year, the season felt so long, but over time, you're like, the way you mentioned 200 hours, like now we're really looking at a whole season in such a short period of time that the minutes really add up, and you really want to leverage as much time as possible on things that are important. And I can share my own perspective on technique-wise, like how my mindset has shifted over the years, because it might be helpful to hear like how some people of different levels might be thinking about it. I remember that in my sophomore and junior year, when I felt like I couldn't even take a shot properly, or I felt like I couldn't even like score 2 points and execute a shot. Every time we'd go and start talking about something that was a little bit more complicated than that, I'd kind of just ignore it and just do it for here and there. But I just kept, even when I was going live and drilling, I just kept focusing on trying to do the things that the things that would maybe matter more and more important, and help me to get better at that. And I remember the feeling of like seeing a new technique in my sophomore year and just like kind of giving a side eye to it just to focus on what's important. But then at the same time, when I'm now in my senior year, now that I've like mastered taking a high crotch and mastered some of those positions, I wouldn't say mastered, but at least had some level of proficiency where I can start thinking about, okay, something else I can do on top and all those things and advance it a little bit. Then I'd hear you mention something in practice, like a ball and chain, or I'm forgetting some of the names, but some like tilts on bottom as well. And then I would start thinking, oh wait, those are pretty cool too. And then now that I feel like I can at least execute a high crotch, then I started adding those things in. But I think it gets really challenging, because it's not just one level and 2 levels, but there's really like 10 different stages people are at. And I'm curious, maybe we can talk to some other people as well, like how they, like what kind of going through their mind when they're trying out different techniques, and what their perspective is on that, because it's challenging as a coach when you have people that are across the board in different skill levels, and we try to box them up to make it a little bit more efficient and simple. But I think it's useful now that we have like almost 2 concurrent programs, that there's the JV side of it and there's a varsity side of it, and sometimes the varsity side will go more complicated drills. And I know there's a benefit in showing all the different possibilities out there, because one person might all of a sudden fall in love with one specific thing, and then they can focus on that on themselves. So I see the value of why that might have been the vision before. But I'm curious how you'll draw the balance, because I know that you mentioned that you'll integrate some of the more essential ones, like a front head, into maybe warm-ups and practice. So we're doing them, maybe we're doing like 50 hours, now it's like 100 hours, as like an analogy. It's probably not that much, but to what degree are you still going to incorporate like learning new technique into that? Like, is it even the time we're spending on new technique, is it still focused on maybe like a small box of essentials, or like how do you draw that balance?
Yeah, and like as we get into the weeds in this conversation about technique, I think you summarize it really well, which is this constant sort of back and forth that coaches go through in their mind, which is those 2 dualities of the approach to technique, which is throw everything at them and see what sticks and what they like, or like build your system is the opposite end of that spectrum, where it's like, we do this, we hit front heads, we hit high crotches, and we hit bars, and that's what we do. And that's what a Peddie wrestler does, and we're going to keep that simple. And I think inevitably it's like, really it's about dialing in and striking that balance. And so it would actually be, I think, really a productive and helpful practice, though it would require a lot of work, to each year try to track how many hours we spend on different techniques and moves, because then you could really turn the knobs and dial it in accordingly. But I don't think the answer is to completely separate ourselves from other techniques that exist. I think having that exposure is good, but I just think it's about being more efficient in our process. So like I said, like if we show and work through the front head, we need to like reintegrate those important foundational moves into almost every practice and find ways to do that. And then still dabble into those other areas, but just being more careful about how much time we're actually allocating to something that might not be as useful or as important. So I think that's kind of how I'm thinking about it. I think like I think like anything else, part of it is easing our way into it, and not like we don't want to just jump to the opposite end of the spectrum and go to that other extreme where we're only doing front heads. I don't think that would be helpful either. But like you said, the two concurrent programs as well. And somebody in their exit meeting said this, I don't remember who, but it really stuck with me, which is like it'd be better to bring both sides, the younger group and the experienced group, together more as the season progresses rather than in the beginning, because in the beginning is really where the younger group has to do the most catching up. So on the one side, the culture piece might suffer a little bit in the beginning in acclimating those young kids to the culture, but at the same time, the advantage is that you're catching them up to the older group much more quickly. So that's like another approach technique wise that we can think about. But yeah, it's really just about identifying those high percentage moves like a front head, like a chop tight waist, as a ride, like a something like a far side cradle as a series, and making sure people feel really confident in that. So it's like, all right, you can have your low single, but if your low single is not working, I'm going to score on a front head. 8 times out of 10, put me in a front head. I know I can score there because I've done it enough, and I feel confident that I can go back to that. And I think it can be really hard for high school wrestlers to sometimes identify that on their own. So making sure that we have something in place that is always that go-to. And I think I keep using front heads as an example because that's what I want to do this year. Thinking about it, like it's got to be something we spend a lot of time on for sure. And it's like, I forget who I was talking to as a father of a wrestler. He's like, I took my kids out to, somewhere in Eastern Europe, like a Dagestan kind of place. And the coach was just like, we're going to spend a whole practice working on outside singles and finishes. Because until I can see that everyone can do it right every time and do it well, like, why are we going to move on, right? Because then you're just going to develop bad habits of drilling it the wrong way. So it's like that mentality. Like, we could just spend a whole practice on front heads and refining our front head and making sure that we can drill it properly.
Yeah, and I think the point you just brought up is what distinguishes it from just solely focusing on like these are the three body wrestling moves. And I think we've wrestled teams like that. I think it was St. Benedict's. I just remember when you coming to us saying that these guys they just do cradles and that's their go-to and that's their skill. And I think it was St. Benedict's. It might have been someone else, but I think there are definitely programs I've seen that just focus on like we're just doing these 5 moves and that's our program's identity. But the way you said it was really interesting because it's like sure you can experiment like try the low single, but you have that foundation already, right? So it's really about let's get that foundation strong and then let's start to experiment now. Like okay, everyone has this toolkit, but then this one person's into low singles and this one person's into this other specific move, and then you can. I think that is what makes like this new strategy kind of unique in that way.
Yeah, I mean, you hit the nail on the head with that summary, and like anything else, right? It's you got to lean into it. We have to try it, and then we can step back and say, well, what worked, what didn't work, or what do we need to change next year? And that's the fun of it. Like I get to do that. I get every year. Like I only have you guys for 4 years, but I have however long I stay at Peddie, 10, 20 years. Like I have all the time in the world to keep workshopping, and then that makes me better as a coach long term, and that's sort of like the long term picture piece. Like this laboratory this year is going to be a proving ground for next year and the year after, and like you can't figure it out until you try it. So this year we got to really lean into it, but it's hard because like, all right, what we don't teach then or what we don't spend as much time on, we're also not defending. So if we're not getting to low singles, then we're not working a lot of low single defense. So it's like, all right, we may not hit low singles, but somebody might hit a low single on us. And that inherently is the catch-22 that as coaches that's, the purgatory of being in a coach. Like we're never going to have enough time to feel really good about everything. But at the high school level, like, you can keep it really simple and be very effective and successful. So
A little bit off topic, but I've always wondered this, you've seen different eras of Peddie Wrestling within like the small sphere of like the 8 years you've been here, right? Where you've had to say goodbye to wrestlers that have been with you for 4 years and then you have to kind of let them go on their own paths wherever they're going. So is it difficult for you when you have to say bye to a certain batch of of guys you're working with. Like I've always wondered like what that like for you, on your perspective of like. Again, I mean, sure you have the group of people, and you build those up, and then you say bye to them. So what's that? What does that feel like for you?
Yeah, some more than others. There's some groups that yeah, couldn't wait until they're gone. No, I'm just kidding. I mean, yeah, I think as time goes on, that definitely gets more and more difficult. It's hard for a number of reasons. It's hard emotionally because you develop that relationship. You see that person really grow. Like, we every time we talk about, we come back to you as an example. The progress that you made in 4 years is profound. And so like it's like, man, like if we have one more year, 2 more years, like what would have been possible? And then it's like the relationship there, whether spoken or not, of like, hey, like we were able to like do that thing together, and I was able to see that happen. You know, like I'm just a mentor in your life for 4 years, but like seeing you grow in that 4 years also has a profound impact on the person who's the mentor, right? Like not just the mentee. And so like there's that emotional piece because it's like developing as a person, etc., and seeing boys and girls turn into men and women. Like you see that happen before your eyes. Like that part is hard, but not as bad because like I know we're also planting seeds and sowing seeds for people to come back like this, and that I love. Like the alumni piece is so much fun. Like especially now that we're like building our own alumni, right? Like there was the alumni of the other older days, and it's all part of the same fabric. It's all Peddie Wrestling. It's all training for the rest of your life. But like this is our brand. This is our era. Like you said, our era. And so that is really special. I love that. A lot of alumni continue to stay in touch in their own ways. But then like as a coach, like the logistical piece, like it sucks because like we just developed for 4 years and then you're gone. It's like right back. It's that cyclical process. But like you have to be accepting of that and embrace that. Like that's just the work of a coach. Like you're gonna literally begin anew. It's corny as hell sometimes to say it, but like you're gonna keep, and it's like lessons learned, right? Like you have young talent come in that has like the Mavoides, and it's like, all right, like how did I manage them well? How did I not manage them well? And it's like, all right, we have these couple kids coming in that have some talent, coming in with some experience and talent. It's like, all right, what lessons did I learn from managing the Mavoides that I can apply to these kids? And then also, like, not to mention, again, we could spend a whole nother hour on this, but thinking about culture, it's like, how am I managing these kids coming in and making sure that they're able to assimilate into the culture that already exists and make sure that that all blends in a really like neat way, like holding them accountable, holding them to our standard, making sure that they earn their way into this program. They're not just going to walk in here and like, oh, like I've done this or that, and like everyone has to earn their spot in this program and earn their sort of right. But yeah, man, it's both challenging and also probably something I enjoy the most about it, right? Like it's different challenges, different groups of people, different ways of thinking about how to connect them all and connect all the pieces. But I'm really excited for what that means, down the line with these, like, how cool will it be 10 years from now when we have like a big wrestling alumni gathering? Like that's special and that's cool. And you'll be able to talk to a Peddie wrestler from 5 years ago that you never met, and then a Peddie wrestler that came 6 years after you, and I'll be able to look at you and say to him, like, you had what you had because of him, and then you guys will be able to talk about things that bond you even though you didn't share the mat together. Like that's cool, and that's what I want to build. That's what I want for you guys. That's what I want for the program, and that's what I want to endure long after I'm gone, right? Like that's legacy, and that's fun. It's fun. It's fun, man. I look forward to this year more than anything, and the wrestling piece, like I said, it's your own creative space and with real life consequences, and it's fun.
Yeah, I feel like we can keep going for hours, but I know you have 5 minutes until you're. So I want to make sure we get the airdrop through and everything. Okay, I mean it'll give us some time to just make sure we don't mess up the airdrop or anything. So, Coach Frank, it's a pleasure doing a second episode with you. For those who want to see the first episode, it's equally as beautiful. We talk about fulfillment in that episode. So it's episode 7. You can check that out. But I just want to say, again, that you built an incredible program, and you've helped a lot of people find a sense of beauty and fulfillment in their own lives through what you've done. And it's something that will be a beautiful part of my life for the rest of my life, and I hope that I can carry whether it's the values and mindsets or the quotes, like always in the fight with me forever, and definitely wrestling forever. So I thank you once again for doing this with me and being in my life.
Yeah, and I'm on. The Baruah podcast is that, right? Like, you're getting people to tell their stories, and like that, I think, is what's most important. Is you're carrying all of that you learned, and then like it's this web that gets created, and we all are part of that and are interconnected through it. And the Baruah podcast is just one example of the many ways in your life that I know you're going to carry those values forward, share them with other people, and I think that's you're going to help someone else. You're going to help multiple people find their sense of fulfillment, and I think that's special and unique. It's also because you're Shari Baruah. So.
All right. Thank you once again. Maybe we could do another one in December, right in the midst of the season. It'll probably be busy because I know when the season starts, they're like all about the season. So we'll see when we meet next. I'll definitely come down for a practice. I'll be here for a week in December. So
I'm down, man. I love doing this, and every time I'm a little bit more.
My
bad. I didn't know if we were just off the record or whatever, but yeah, definitely down to do some more podcasting, and I think each time I get a little bit more bold in terms of sharing stories, and this one has been very one-sided. I know I didn't ask you a lot of questions, but yeah, I would love to touch base on how Michigan is going and how school is going in that experience, and so we'll definitely have to circle back and give it a part 3.
For sure. All right, let's call it a day. Thank you for tuning in to my episode. If you enjoyed that episode, I guarantee that you'll love this episode right here. The best way to support the channel is by hitting the subscribe button. It'll help me to upgrade the channel, get better guests, better production, and overall more episodes for you. And by hitting the subscribe button, you'll ensure that you'll never miss a new release. While you're at it, hit the like button, leave a comment, and share the link with your best friend. Thank you once again for tuning in, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.